Welcome to our elegant gathering.
Margaret Wilson stood beside her husband's grave, feeling the cold October wind cut through her black dress. After 42 years of marriage, Richard was gone. Heart attack, sudden, no warning. Just like that, the man who had held her hand through everything was now 6 feet under the ground. She was 68 years old, and felt every single year pressing down on her shoulders. Her son David stood next to her, but there was distance between them. Not physical distance, he was right there, but something else. Something that had grown over the past 5 years since he married Jessica. Jessica stood on David's other side, checking her phone at the funeral. Margaret noticed but said nothing. She had learned to say nothing when it came to Jessica. The pastor finished his final words. People began to walk away, offering Margaret their condolences. Hands touched her shoulder. Voices said things like, "He was a good man, and let us know if you need anything," but Margaret barely heard them. She was thinking about the house. The big, beautiful house that Richard had worked so hard to buy 30 years ago. The house where they'd raised David. The house filled with memories. "Mom, we need to talk," David said quietly as the crowd thinned out. Margaret looked at her son. He was 40 years old now, but in that moment he looked tired, older than he should. "Not today." "Sweetheart," Margaret said softly. "Let me have today." "It can't wait," Jessica said, stepping forward. Her voice wasn't soft at all. "We've been patient long enough." Margaret stared at her daughter-in-law. Jessica was 35, beautiful, always dressed like she was going to a business meeting. Even now, at a funeral, her makeup was perfect. "Jessica, please," David said, but his voice had no strength in it. "No, David, we agreed." Jessica turned to Margaret. "That house is too big for you. You're alone now. You don't work. You're just there, taking up space in a 4-bedroom house that could be worth something." Margaret felt like she'd been slapped. "Richard just died 3 days ago? And I'm sorry about that, I really am," Jessica said, though her face showed no sorrow at all. "But facts are facts. You can't maintain that house. You can't afford the taxes on your own. It makes sense for you to move into a smaller place, maybe a nice senior apartment." "Jessica, that's enough," David finally said, but he didn't look at his wife. He didn't look at his mother either. "I'm just being practical," Jessica continued. "David and I have been living in that tiny condo for 5 years. We want to start a family, but we need space. You have space you don't need. It's simple math." Margaret's hands were shaking, not from cold, from rage, from grief, from disbelief that this conversation was happening over Richard's grave. "That house is my home," Margaret said quietly. "Well, maybe it's time for a new home," Jessica replied. "We'll help you pack. We'll even help you find a place. But we need an answer soon, Margaret, very soon." Margaret looked at her son, waiting for him to say something, waiting for him to defend her, to tell his wife that this was cruel and wrong and not the time. But David just stood there, looking at the ground. "I need to go," Margaret said. She turned and walked toward the parking lot, her heels sinking slightly into the soft cemetery grass behind her. She heard Jessica say, "She come around. She has no choice." Margaret sat in her car for 20 minutes before she could stop shaking enough to drive. When she finally got home, the house felt enormous and empty. Richard's coffee cup was still on the kitchen counter from 3 mornings ago. His reading glasses were on the side table in the living room. She picked up the glasses and held them against her chest. And finally she let herself cry. She cried for the husband she'd lost. She cried for the son who'd changed. And she cried because she was scared. Jessica was right about one thing. The house was expensive. The taxes, the maintenance, the utilities. Richard had handled all of that. Could she really do this alone? Her phone buzzed. A text from Jessica. "We'll come by Thursday to talk details. Start thinking about what you want to keep." Margaret put the phone down and looked around her home. Her beautiful home filled with 42 years of memories. "What do I do, Richard?" She whispered to the empty room. The room, of course, didn't answer. Thursday came too fast. Margaret had barely slept since the funeral. Every time she closed her Eyes, she heard Jessica's voice saying old and useless and taking up space. She'd spent 2 days looking at the house through new eyes. The kitchen where she'd made thousands of meals. The living room where David had taken his first steps. The bedroom where Richard had held her just a week ago, not knowing it would be. The last time. How could she leave this? The doorbell rang at exactly 2 o'clock. Jessica was always on time. Margaret opened the door. David and Jessica stood there. Jessica was holding a folder. "Hi, Mom," David said, leaning in to kiss her cheek. Margaret let him, but she felt stiff. "Come in," she said. They sat in the living room. Jessica immediately opened her folder and pulled out papers. "So I've done some research," Jessica began, all business. "There's a nice senior community about 20 miles from here. 1-bedroom apartments, activities, a cafeteria. You wouldn't have to cook or clean or maintain anything." She slid a brochure across the coffee table. Margaret didn't pick it up. "I don't want to live in a senior community," Margaret said. "Well, what do you want?" Jessica asked, her patience already thinning. "You can't stay here. The property taxes alone are $15,000 a year. Can you afford that on Social Security?" Margaret felt her face flush. She'd never talked about money with anyone except Richard. It felt invasive and wrong. "I'll figure something out," Margaret said. "How?" Jessica pressed. "You haven't worked in 30 years. You have no income except Social Security. Richard's life insurance will help, but it won't last forever, not with expenses like this house. How do you know about Richard's life insurance?" Margaret asked sharply. Jessica waved her hand dismissively. "David told me. The point is, you're being impractical. You need to face reality. The reality is that my husband just died." Margaret's voice rose. "The reality is that you're sitting in my home 4 days after I buried him, trying to kick me out." "Nobody's kicking you out," David said quickly. "We're just trying to help you see that I'm a burden." Margaret cut him off. That's what this is about, isn't it? You want this house and I'm in the way. That's not fair," David said, but he didn't deny it. "What's not fair," Jessica said, standing up, "is you sitting in a 4-bedroom house while your son and his wife can barely afford their rent. What's not fair is you clinging to the past while the rest of us are trying to build a future." "Jessica," David said, finally showing some backbone, but Jessica wasn't finished. "I'm sorry, but someone has to say it. You're old, Margaret. You're alone. This house is too much for you. What are you going to do when something breaks? When the roof needs replacing? When you fall down those stairs and nobody finds you for days?" Each word hit Margaret like a physical blow. "Get out," Margaret said quietly. "Mom," David started. "Get out," Margaret shouted. "Get out of my house right now." Jessica grabbed her folder and stood. "Fine, but you have until the end of the month. Margaret, either you make arrangements to move, or we'll have to explore other options." "Other options? What does that mean?" "It means David is Richard's heir. It means legally, things might not be as simple as you think." Jessica headed for the door. "Is that a threat?" Margaret asked. Jessica turned back with a cold smile. "It's reality, something you clearly need help facing." David followed his wife out, pausing only to look back at his mother with sad, guilty eyes. But he still left. Margaret stood in her living room, shaking with anger and fear. Jessica had threatened her, legally. What did that mean? She picked up her phone and scrolled through her contacts. Her finger stopped at one name, Robert Chun, attorney at law, Richard's lawyer. And his friend for 20 years. She pressed call. Robert Chun's office was downtown in one of those old buildings with character. Wooden floors, tall windows, shelves filled with legal books that probably nobody read anymore. Margaret sat in the waiting room, her purse clutched on her lap. She'd barely eaten in days and knew she looked terrible. Dark circles under her eyes, hair not quite right. But she didn't care about any of that anymore. "Margaret?" Robert appeared in the doorway. He was in his mid-60s, with gray hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Come in, please." His office was warm and comfortable. Pictures of his grandchildren covered one wall. Richard smiled at her from a photo on Robert's desk. The two of them at a golf tournament years ago. I'm so sorry about Richard, Robert said, sitting across from her. I wanted to call, but I thought you needed time. Thank you, Margaret said. Her voice cracked slightly. I need your help, Robert. Of course, anything. Margaret told him everything. The confrontation at the funeral. Jessica's cruelty. The threats about legal options. Her voice shook as she repeated Jessica's words. Old, useless, taking up space. Robert's face grew darker as she spoke. That's unconscionable, he said when she finished. Putting that pressure on you now, as David tried to stop her. David doesn't stop anything when it comes to Jessica, Margaret said bitterly. He just lets her run everything. I barely recognize my son anymore. Robert was quiet for a moment, then he leaned back in his chair. Margaret, what Jessica said about legal options, that concerns me. I need to ask you something directly. Do you know the contents of Richard's will? Margaret blinked. His will? I thought we talked about it years ago. Everything goes to me, doesn't it? We set that up together. When was the last time you looked at the will? I don't know. Maybe 15 years ago, when we first had it drawn up? Robert nodded slowly. Richard updated his will 6 months ago. He came to see me and we made some significant changes. Margaret's heart started pounding. What kind of changes? He didn't tell you? No, we talked about everything, but no, he never mentioned updating the will. Fear crept into her voice. Robert, what did he do? Did he leave everything to David? Can Jessica really kick me out? Robert stood and walked to his filing cabinet. He pulled out a thick folder and returned to his desk. Richard was very specific about not wanting to worry you, Robert said carefully. He said you had enough stress with his health issues. But he was also very clear about his intentions. He opened the folder and pulled out a document. Margaret could see Richard's signature at the bottom, dated 6 months ago. Right after Jessica had made that comment at the family dinner about when we finally get the house. Margaret had been in the kitchen then, but Richard had heard it. He'd been quiet the rest of the night. The house, Robert said, looking directly at Margaret, is entirely yours. Richard put it in something called a life estate. That means you have the absolute right to live there for the rest of your life. Nobody can force you out. Not David, not Jessica, not anyone. Margaret felt tears spring to her eyes. Really? Really? But there's more, Robert flipped through the pages. Richard also set up a trust fund specifically for the house expenses. Property taxes, repairs, maintenance, it's all covered for as long as you live there. He transferred several investments into this trust. You won't have to worry about affording the house. I don't understand, Margaret whispered. Why didn't he tell me? He wanted to, Robert said gently. He made me promise that if anything happened to him, I would wait 1 week and then contact you. He wanted you to have time to grieve first. He paused. But he also wanted you to know the truth. Before anyone tried to pressure you. He knew, Margaret said, understanding flooding through her. He knew Jessica would do this. Richard loved you very much, Robert said, and he wanted to make sure you were protected. Margaret covered her face with her hands and cried. But this time, there were tears of relief. Margaret left Robert's office, feeling like she could breathe again for the first time in days. Richard had protected her. Even from the grave, he was still taking care of her, but Robert had asked her to come back the next day. There was more to discuss, he'd said. More that Richard had included in his will that night, Jessica called. Margaret, we need to talk about the house, Jessica said without even a hello. I've been speaking with a real estate agent. If we list it by next month, we could catch the spring market. Margaret almost laughed, almost. I'm not selling the house, Jessica. Don't be stubborn. You can't afford. I'm not discussing this with you, Margaret interrupted. If you want to talk about Richard's estate, you can speak with his lawyer. There was silence on the other. And then his lawyer? Why would I need to talk to his lawyer? Because that's who handles estates, Margaret said calmly. His name is Robert Chun. I'll text you his number. Margaret, what's going on? Jessica's voice had changed. There was uncertainty in it now. Goodbye, Jessica. Margaret hung up, she. slept well that night for the first time since Richard died. The next morning, Margaret returned to Robert's office. This time, she felt stronger. She'd put on her good dress, the navy one Richard had always loved. She'd done her hair properly. She looked like herself again. "How are you feeling?" Robert asked as she sat down. "Better," Margaret said honestly. "Much better." "Good, because we need to discuss the rest of Richard's will, and I want you to be prepared." Robert pulled out the folder again. "As I mentioned, the house is yours. The trust covers all expenses." But Richard didn't stop there. He laid out several documents in front of her. "Richard was very smart with his money," Robert continued. "Over the years, he made investments, built savings, acquired assets. He kept most of this separate from your joint accounts because he wanted to surprise you when you both retired. He was planning to tell you on your 45th anniversary. Next year," Margaret's throat tightened. "They'd never make it to 45 years now." "The total estate," Robert said carefully, "is worth approximately $2.4 million. Margaret stared at him. "What?" "The house is worth about $600,000. There are investment accounts, retirement funds, life insurance, and some property Richard inherited from his uncle that he rented out. Altogether, it's substantial." "I had no idea," Margaret whispered. "He never said." "He wanted to be sure you were taken care of," Robert said. "But here's the important part, Margaret. Under the terms of the will, you inherit everything with it." "One exception," Margaret looked up sharply. "David?" "Yes and no." Robert pulled out another document. "David is designated to inherit the house and remaining estate assets after your death. But Richard included a very specific clause about the house." He pointed to a paragraph in the middle of the page. Margaret leaned forward to read it. "What does this mean?" she asked. "It means that if anyone tries to pressure you, coerce you, or force you to leave the house before your death, they are immediately and completely removed from the will. Everything would then go to the charity Richard designated, the children's hospital where David was born." Margaret's hand went to her mouth. "Richard was very clear about this," Robert said. "He wrote an accompanying letter explaining his reasoning. He loved David, but he was deeply concerned about Jessica's influence. He wanted to protect you. But he also wanted David to understand that family means taking care of each other, not taking from each other. So if Jessica keeps pushing me ... quote, Margaret started. "If she does, and if you choose to invoke this clause, David loses everything. You'd remain in the house with full financial support until your death, then everything goes to charity." Margaret sat back in her chair, processing this. Richard hadn't just protected her, he'd given her power. "There's going to be a reading of the will," Robert said. "I've scheduled it for Monday. David and Jessica will be there. They don't know about any of this yet." Margaret smiled for the first time in weeks. "I'll be there," she said. Monday morning arrived cold and bright. Margaret drove to Robert's office with her hands steady on the wheel. She'd dressed carefully, her good black suit, pearls, the watch Richard had given her on their 30th anniversary. She looked like a woman who knew her worth. David and Jessica were already in the conference room when Margaret arrived. Jessica wore a designer dress and had clearly spent time on her appearance. She looked like someone expecting good news. David just looked nervous. "Mom," he said, standing when she entered. He tried to hug her, but Margaret kept it brief. "David," she said politely, then took a seat across the table from them. Jessica's eyes narrowed slightly. Something about Margaret's demeanor had changed. And Jessica noticed Robert entered with his assistant, both carrying folders. They sat at the head of the table. "Thank you all for coming," Robert began formally. "We're here for the reading of Richard Wilson's last will and testament, dated July 5th, 10th of last year." "Last year?" David said, surprised. "Dad updated his will?" "Yes," Robert said. "He made substantial revisions 6 months before his death." He opened the folder. "I'll go through the relevant sections. The entire document is available for review, but I'll highlight the key provisions." Jessica leaned forward, her eyes on the papers. "First," Robert said, "all joint assets automatically transfer to Margaret as the surviving spouse. This includes checking accounts, savings, and the vehicle." That was standard. Jessica looked impatient. Second, the family home at 412 Oak Street is transferred to Margaret Wilson with a life estate provision. This means Mrs. Wilson has the absolute right to occupy the residence for the remainder of her life. This right cannot be challenged. Sold or transferred, Jessica's expression flickered. Wait, what does that mean exactly? It means the house is your mother-in-law's until she dies, Robert said plainly. But David inherits it eventually, right? Jessica asked. I'll get to that, Robert said. He continued reading. A trust fund has been established to cover all expenses related to the property, including but not limited to property taxes, insurance, maintenance, and repairs. This trust is funded with $400,000 in investments. David's eyes widened. 400,000? Margaret said nothing. She watched her son and daughter-in-law process this information. Third, Robert continued, investment accounts, retirement funds, and other liquid assets totaling approximately $1.6 million are transferred to Margaret Wilson. Jessica actually gasped, $1.6 million? Where did that come from? Richard was an excellent investor, Robert said calmly. He managed his money well. And nobody thought to mention this before? Jessica's voice was rising. We'd been struggling to pay rent while there was nearly $2 million just sitting there. It was Richard's money, Robert said firmly. He chose how to distribute it. This is unbelievable, Jessica muttered. Let him finish, David said. Quietly, and for the first time, Margaret heard something in her son's voice that sounded like the boy she'd raised. Finally, Robert said, the remainder of the estate, including the family home after Margaret's death, is designated to pass to David Wilson with the following critical condition. The room went completely silent. Robert looked directly at Jessica as he read, if any heir or their spouse attempts to pressure, coerce, manipulate, or otherwise force Margaret Wilson to vacate the family home, or if they create an environment of emotional distress intended to drive her from her residence, they will be immediately and permanently removed from this will. All assets would then transfer to Seattle Children's Hospital. The color drained from Jessica's face. What? She whispered. David turned to look at his wife, understanding dawning in his eyes. Richard included a letter, Robert said, pulling out an envelope. Margaret, he wanted me to read this aloud, if you're comfortable with that. Margaret nodded, her eyes already filling with tears. Robert opened the letter and began to read in Richard's words. Words that would change everything. Robert cleared his throat and began reading. My dearest Margaret, if you're hearing this, that I'm gone and I'm so sorry I had to leave you. 42 years wasn't enough. I wanted 42 more. I've written this letter because I need you to know something important. You are not a burden. You are not useless. You are not too old for anything. You are the love of my life, and you deserve to live in peace in the home we built together. David, son, I love you, but I've watched you change over the past few years, and it breaks my heart. I know Jessica has strong opinions about money, about success, about what matters in life, but I need you to remember what your mother and I taught you. Family isn't about what you can get from each other. It's about what you give. Your mother gave everything to raise you. She sacrificed her career, her independence, her own dreams to make sure you had the best life possible. And now that I'm gone, she deserves your support, not your judgment. I've set up these provisions not because I don't trust you, David, but because I do trust you. I trust that when faced with the choice between money and integrity, between inheritance and character, you'll choose correctly. Margaret, my love, you don't need anyone's permission to live your life. You don't need to make yourself smaller to make others comfortable. That house is yours. Your security is yours. Your dignity is yours. Live well, live fully, and know that I will love you until the stars go dark. Yours always, Richard. The silence in the room was absolute. Margaret was crying quietly. David's face was red, his eyes wet. Jessica sat frozen, her carefully made-up face pale. That's everything, Robert said, placing the letter on the table. Are there any questions? So let me understand this, Jessica said, her voice shaking. If we push Margaret out, we get nothing? David gets nothing? That's correct, Robert said. But we didn't know, Jessica started. Didn't know what? Margaret spoke for the first time since the reading began. Her voice was steady. Didn't know that you couldn't bully a grieving widow out of her home? Didn't know that treating me like garbage might have consequences? Mom, I'm sorry, David said, his voice breaking. I'm so sorry. I let Jessica ... I didn't stand up for you. I knew it was wrong, and I didn't stop it. No, you didn't, Margaret said. She looked at her son, and her heart ached. Somewhere inside this man was the little boy who used to bring her dandelions from the yard. But you're stopping it now, aren't you? David nodded, tears streaming down his face. I am. I promise I am, Jessica stood abruptly. This is manipulative. Controlling from beyond the grave, it's not fair. You know what's not fair? Margaret said, standing to face her daughter-in-law. Being told you're useless 3 days after your husband dies. Being threatened in your own home. Having your grief ignored because someone else wants your house. I was just being practical. You were being cruel, Margaret said, and Richard knew you would be. That's why he protected me. That's why he gave me this choice. Choice? Jessica said, What choice? Margaret looked at Robert, then back at Jessica and David. The choice, Margaret said, to decide whether you're part of this family or not. Richard gave me the power to invoke that clause or not. It's my decision. David's face went white. Mom ... Margaret was quiet for a long moment, then she turned to her son. I want my son back, she said softly. The boy who was kind. Who cared about people more than things. Who understood that love isn't measured in property values. She paused. Can you be that person again, David? David looked at his mother, then at his wife, then back at his mother. Yes, he whispered. I can. I will. Then come have dinner with me tomorrow, Margaret said. Just you and me. We'll talk. Really talk like we used to? I'll be there, David promised. Margaret picked up her purse and walked to the door. She paused and looked back at Jessica. The house is mine, she said simply. Richard made sure of that. And I'm going to live there happily for as long as I choose. You can accept that, or you can leave. But you will never make me feel small again. She walked out with her head high, feeling Richard's love surrounding her like a warm embrace. Behind her, she heard David say to Jessica, We need to talk. But that was their conversation to have. Margaret drove home to her beautiful house, parked in the driveway and sat for a moment looking at the place where she'd spent so many happy years. Thank you, Richard, she whispered. Then she went inside, made herself a cup of tea and sat in Richard's favorite chair by the window. The house didn't feel empty anymore. It felt like home.